Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Prayer of Columbus, the prayer that will sandwich in between Passage to India and The Sleepers, a very important poem. Now, this Prayer of Columbus is going to be a controversial poem for us. We mentioned this as Columbus was referenced in Passage to India. Because, of course, today we have a completely different view of Columbus and his life story than Whitman would have had during his lifetime. In some ways, we're going to as well see this as a rare, maybe you'll put a question mark after the word rare, dramatic monologue of Leaves of Grass. And you'll remember in our study of Tennyson's Ulysses and Browning's Last Duchess and Porphyria's Lover, among many other dramatic monologues, will always ask two questions. What is it? Who is the speaker, and who is the speaker speaking to? What's the dramatic context? Now, you could make the argument, that's why I said put the question mark after rare, that almost all of Leaves of Grass is a dramatic monologue of some kind or another, and we could obviously debate that one later. I think that the real challenge of Whitman's life is to study the ways in which he had to come to terms with the great pain and suffering of his life. That is to say, how well could he actually live the very theodicy that we've been playing with? Not why did this happen to me, but rather why did this happen for me? In late 1873, Whitman was 54 years old, 19 years, almost 20 years away from his death, and yet already there was going to be a whole lot of pain coming his way, and we're going to see it in this poem. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, our playlist, and that from inscriptions on, the very introductory word come, which was going to play into this study, that you've been with us right up to Passage to India, as we just said. Now, we always reference our Nortons to begin, and our Nortons will tell us that this poem was published in Harper's Magazine of March 1874. Whitman asking and receiving $60 for it. It appeared in 2 rivulets in 1876, and finally improved by omission of 2 mediocre lines and a phrase from another line in Leaves of Grass, 1881. There is a manuscript of some 20 scraps of paper of varying sizes, which shows considerable reworking of trial lines. Whitman actually wrote to Ellen O'Connor, an admirer, and he said this, quote, "As I see it now, I shouldn't wonder if I have unconsciously put a sort of autobiographical dash in it," talking, of course, about this poem. This was unconscious understatement, and another woman admirer, Miss Anne Gilchrist, made the identification explicit, quote, "You, too," again speaking to Whitman, "you too have sailed over stormy seas to your goal, surrounded with mocking disbelievers. You too have paid the great price of health, our Columbus. On January the 23rd of the preceding year," okay, Whitman had suffered a paralytic stroke. Just 4 months later, May 23rd, he lost his mother. During the 1870s, despite occasional placement of poems in the magazines, he was feeling the public neglect. He too was battered, wrecked, and sore, as we'll see in the opening lines. But the deep purport, now to finish with Norton's, the deep purport linking this poem with Passage to India is the poet's profoundly felt need of divine sanction for his work, his body of poetry, which had come from the potent felt interior command for which he, as Columbus, prays. Now there is a realization that Whitman lived a very difficult life. Whitman is person, as we commented on our 5 Ps of Whitman. Just mentioned, he was deeply concerned about all of the scandals of the Grant administration, obviously the failure of Reconstruction, and that descent into the Gilded Age, as it would be referred to. He lost his friendship with William Douglas O'Connor right at this very period of time. Some have argued that it had to do with black suffrage and the views of black suffrage. January of 1873, he has a paralytic stroke. Then in February, his sister-in-law Maddie dies. Then in May, his mother dies. Then in October, Tom Ulcer, a Camden friend of his, is killed by accident. And as Norton's was saying, his books were not well received at this point either. In other words, it's going to be a challenge for him. Now, notice this is Prayer of Columbus, because this is a dramatic monologue. By the way, remember the word prayer from Song of Myself 24? The scent of these armpit aromas finer than any prayer. Do you remember this? And his use of the word prayer is fascinating. He'll say it this way. "A battered, wrecked old man," go back to Song of Myself 34 for battered. Wrecked. In Sands at 70, we're going to hear this word one other time. A Carol Closing 69 is the name of that poem. He identifies himself as an old man at 54. Of course, the war has broken down his health, as we've commented already. Thrown on this savage sore, you'll remember this one from 1 Hour to Madness. Enjoy the use of the word savage. Far, far from home. Think about Odysseus and the challenge of passage to India. In other words, sailing out, but now you're far away. Pent by the sea in dark, rebellious brows. 12 dreary months. Now, we're talking, of course, about Columbus's fourth and final voyage when everything goes wrong. By the way, you'll remember Penn from Penn-a-Baking Rivers, right? Sore, stiff with many toils, sickened and nigh to death. Notice all these things. There's 7 of these things that just stacked in a row, all the bad things. I take my way along the island's edge, venting a heavy heart. So from sore, we go to a heavy heart. I am too full of woe. Do you remember the opening? Guys, I've told you, I think Whitman's having a great time with these poems he's writing. Do you remember the opening lines of Paradise Lost? That great text on theodicy, why must bad things happen? It is to justify the ways of God to man. We've given full lectures on it. But do you remember the opening lines of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose taste brought death into the world and all our woe? Here it is. I am too full of woe. Happily, 5 times we'll get this word in this poem. I may not live another day. We think, of course, of the biblical Job. I cannot rest, O God. I cannot eat or drink or sleep. Again, we're back to our 3s. Till I put forth myself, my prayer, once more to thee. In other words, it's repeated. It'll remind us a lot of Psalm 13. How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord, forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? That poem will have resonances here, as will several other poems that are psalms. Bathe myself once more in thee. Commune with thee. Back to that notion of embracing. Report myself once more to thee. This idea of once more, it's being repeated. In other words, Whitman will see Columbus as a very pious man who is always praying. Now, how much of this poem is Columbus versus Whitman is always going to be the debate of scholars. And then we're going to get 6 of these thou knowest, which will take us to Psalm 139. Thou hast searched me and know me. Thou knowest my years entire, my life. My long and crowded life of active work, not adoration merely. In other words, Whitman is going to argue Columbus didn't sail the ocean blue in 1492 just for admiration. Thou knowest the prayers and vigils of my youth. Thou knowest, again, the piety. Thou knowest my manhood's solemn and visionary meditations. Thou knowest how before I commenced, I devoted all to come to thee. Again, this use of the word come, the very first word of the deathbed edition of Lisa Grass. Thou knowest I have in age ratified all those vows and strictly kept them. Thou knowest I have not once lost nor faith nor ecstasy in thee, in shackles, prisoned, in disgrace, repining not, accepting all from thee as duly come from thee. Now, Norton's will tell us about these lines that Columbus's dark years, his imprisonment after the 3rd voyage, the death of Isabella, the neglect of Ferdinand, the poverty and physical afflictions were known to Whitman through the pages of Washington Irving's Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, an 1828 offering, available in the 1861 Putnam edition of the works and elsewhere. In fact, in the manuscript prose jottings for this poem, Whitman transcribed several phrases verbatim from Irving's terminal essay, Observations on the Character of Columbus. All my enterprises, back to the poem, all my enterprises have been filled with thee. My speculations, plans begun and carried on in thoughts of thee. Sailing, next passage to India, sailing the deep or journeying the land for thee. Intentions, purports, aspirations, mine, leaving results to thee. By the way, again, leaves of grass and leaving. I told you, he loves to play with this word. Oh, I am sure they really came from thee. Back to the word come. The urge, the ardor, the unconquerable will. The unconquerable will gets used one only time in all Leaves of Grass, and it's right here. The potent, felt, interior command, stronger than words. Back to translinguistics. A message from the heavens whispering to me, even in sleep, these sped me on. This idea of being inspired in the muse is all playing out here. By me and these works, by me and these, the work so far accomplished, By the way, you got 3 of these by me. By me, earth's elder cloyed and stifled lands, uncloyed, unloosened. The idea, of course, for Whitman is that what Columbus brought was enlightenment when he arrived, south of what is present-day America. By me, the hemispheres rounded and tied, the unknown to the known. And as we've said, the new is the new, the NEW is the KNEW. The end, now to continue, I know not. It is all in thee. In other words, what will be the implications of my actions? Or small or great, I know not. Happily what broad fields, what lands, happily the brutish measures, happily the brutish measureless human undergrowth, I know. Now, many have read this as a racist line, and I think it's easily seen that way. Transplanted there may rise to stature knowledge worthy thee. Happily the swords, I know, may there indeed be turned to reaping tools. Now, this idea of moving from war to peace is, of course, an interesting idea. This would be, for Whitman, the hope of Columbus. Haply, the lifeless cross I know, Europe's dead cross, may bud and blossom there. Now, this is, of course, pure Whitman. We've seen this so many times, the idea that all of the history of Europe culminates in the history of America. One effort more. My altar, this bleak sand. So he pictures Columbus on the sand making prayer to God. That thou, O God, my life has lighted. With ray of light, we're back to the light imagery, of course, borrowed from Plato's Republic 7 and the cave allegory. Steady, ineffable, vouchsafed of thee, light rare, untellable, lighting the very light, beyond all signs, descriptions, languages. For that, O God, be it my last word here on my knees. That is to say, the word, the logos, it takes us back to stronger than words. Old, he says of himself, poor and paralyzed, I thank thee. And as we've already commented, Whitman himself will be paralyzed in this year, and it will then become problematic for him, no question. And he'll say it, I thank thee. In other words, this is his theodicy. And the challenge for Whitman, I think, all his life was to actually live his theodicy. No easy task. My terminus near, the end is coming. Now we're going to see more and more of this as we read Leaves of Grass now, that Whitman becomes acutely aware of his mortality. By the way, you'll remember this from Song of the Answer too, this use of the word terminus. The clouds already closing in upon me, the voyage balked, the course disputed, lost, I yield my ships to thee. My hands, my limbs grow nerveless. In other words, this is the end for him. My brain feels racked, bewildered. Let the old timbers part, I will not part. Again, notice the defiance. I will cling fast to thee, O God. Again, this hugging theme all the way through Leaves of Grass. Though the waves buffet me, only use of that word in Leaves of Grass, thee at least I know. In other words, there's this idea that the strong faith of Columbus is what will get him through. Obviously, Whitman as well has a certain professed faith. A faith, of course, in Leaves of Grass. It is, and then he'll ask 4 of these rhetorical questions. And it's at this moment that we begin to recognize Whitman is moved from Columbus now to speak of himself. Is it the prophet's thought I speak, or am I raving? What do I know of life? What of myself? And of course, this idea, what do I know of life, is our epistemological fallibilism. Obviously, what do I know of myself is our ontology of the Big Five. I know not even my own work, past or present. Dim, ever-shifting guesses of it spread before me. By the way, this is the only use of the word guesses in all of Leaves of Grass. Of newer, better worlds, their mighty parturition. You'll remember in Outlines for a Tomb, Part 2, you saw this word. That is to say, the birthing process. Mocking, perplexing me. This idea that Whitman will admit that he's given his life to this project that we'll call Leaves of Grass, but he's not convinced that it's of any real great value. I think, again, T.S. Eliot in Four Quartets, we'll see this several times, right? That was a way of putting it, not very satisfactory. A paraphastic study in a worn-out poetic flesh, and leaving one still with the intolerable wrestle with words and meaning. The poetry does not matter. This idea of being uncertain about what it is that one has done is, I think, learned from a poem like this. Now, this is how he ends it. And these things I see suddenly, it's like an epiphany. And what what mean they? As if some miracle, some hand divine unsealed my eyes. Again, back to Republic 7. Shadowy, vast shapes smile through the air and sky. 19 times in Leaves of Grass the word smile gets used, or a derivative. And on the distant waves, we're back to at the beginning, and obviously passage to India, sail countless ships. In other words, he sees the future. What Columbus brought will bring more ships. Obviously, some will argue that's a blessing, and many, of course, will argue a horrific curse. And anthems in new tongues I hear saluting me. Anthems is used only one time in Leaves of Grass, and it's here. You'll remember in Song of Myself, passage 4, this use of the word mocking. I have no mockings or argument. I witness and wait, he will say. Well, what are we going to do with a poem like this? How are we going to speak of it in terms of messages? I think this is a powerful poem to me because it suggests that even the most optimistic, you'll remember Whitman saying that he likes to keep on the sunny side of life, as we said in earlier lectures, even the most optimistic, and we call Whitman an informed optimist, right, still struggle with despair at times, especially once all these terrible things had happened, one right after the other, stacking one right after the other. It was a horrific, horrific, challenging year for him. Again, at 2b, the dramatic monologue reminds us a lot of the conversation that Job will have in that biblical text with God before the theophany. At 3a, well, Whitman got his information from, as we've already said, Washington Irving's The Life and Voyage of Christopher Columbus, as well as a poem by Joel Barlow's The Columbiad. And these two poems, I think, inform tremendously this poem. We've mentioned, obviously, the power of the Psalms. I think there's a lot of the power of the biblical Psalms in this passage. Finally, at 3b, how can we own a poem like this? Well, how about this one? What was a time that you doubted the value of your work, the value of your worth, and did some kind of belief or faith help you to get through that experience? Well, I hope you're continuing to be challenged by your study of Leaves of Grass. Thank you.